On Life and Meaning is brought to you by Blumenthal Performing Arts, celebrating its 25th year presenting the best in the performing arts, sharing and employing the arts as a major catalyst to strengthen education, building community cohesiveness, and advancing economic growth. Further support is provided by Foundation for the Carolinas, inspiring philanthropy and empowering individuals to create a better community. And by the Arts and Science Council, Charlotte-Mecklenburg's resource hub and lead advocate for the regional cultural community, providing culture for all.
I value relationships. People ask me as you get older, and I know I'm probably entering the last quarter of the game of life. And people say, what do you like to do? And really what it comes down to, I like being around people that I like. And it could be on a golf course. It could be sitting around having a glass of wine or eating a good meal. It could be watching a movie. But I really value relationships now, particularly as you get older and you begin to lose people who have been in your life. You value them even more. So that's really what moves me.
Clarence Clay Armbrister is president of Johnson C. Smith University, a historically Black university in Charlotte, North Carolina. He assumed the role in January 2018. President Armbrister has over 35 years' experience in the private and public sectors, including time in senior administrative and leadership positions at Temple University, Johns Hopkins University, the School District of Philadelphia, and Girard College. In addition to his background in education, President Armbrister has held executive positions in law, government, and finance. His volunteer and public service recognition is extensive and varied. In this episode, we explore Johnson C. Smith University, historically Black colleges and universities, public service, a family story, and the value of relationships. I'm Mark Paris, and this is On Life and Meaning. President Armbrister, thank you for your time today.
Great to be here.
How do you describe Johnson C. Smith University?
Well, Johnson C. Smith is an historically Black college and university located here in Charlotte. It has about 1,500 students. We have 23 majors and degree programs. We just opened up about 2 years ago our first graduate program in social work, with a particular focus on cultural competency, which has proven to be a very, very popular degree program. In fact, we just had our accrediting body here for that program on campus yesterday, and we described to that site visitor how committed we are to the program, in fact, even thinking about expanding it. But Johnson C. Smith serves a population of students, many of whom are African American, but not all of whom are. We've recently had outreaches, particularly in the Latino community, but particularly it's an institution for the underserved. It has served populations for people of access, which grows out of its history of being created shortly after the Civil War for freedmen here in North Carolina.
What is the demographic profile of your student body?
Currently, we have approximately about 87% of our students are African American. Latino population is about 6 to 7%, and then others who don't identify or identified as other.
Mm-hmm. And what would you say are the strengths of Johnson C. Smith University?
Well, we're rooted in the liberal arts tradition. We like to think that we produce graduates who can think critically, communicate effectively, work independently as well as collaboratively, but most importantly, demonstrate competence and excellence in their chosen fields. And some of those fields in which we seem to excel are in our STEM program. We made a significant investment in the STEM program recently. It's our newest building, about a $20 to $35 million building here on campus. So we have a lot of students who are in the STEM areas, biology, chemistry, many of whom are going on to either med school or doing further research. We also have a very strong liberal arts program. We have a good business program. Sports management is another major that comes to mind in which we have significant interest.
And what would you say the university could do better?
Oh, you can always do better at many things. Our focus really is trying to make sure that we prepare our students for the world outside of Johnson C. Smith. So one of the areas upon which I tend to focus is really totally radicalizing our career planning and placement areas here, so that we touch students not only academically, but make sure that they're prepared to go out and join the workforce, or if they want to go to graduate school, go to graduate school. One of the things that I think we can really do a better job of is making sure that when a student leaves Johnson C. Smith, they have had an experience while here that prepares them for the outside world. So the goal is to totally redo our career planning and placement. We look to the point where as soon as a student is admitted to Johnson C. Smith, we want to make sure that they are paired with not only an academic counselor, but also a career planning and placement counselor. And the goal is that by the summer of their sophomore year, they will have had a significant and meaningful work or internship experience outside of Johnson C. Smith, so that really by their senior year, they're really not looking for a job as much, but they really are looking to choose among job offers that they have. And we think that in a place like Charlotte in particular, we should be able to take advantage of the multitude of opportunities that are here. You know, we're the second largest financial center in the country. We have 7 or 8 Fortune 500 companies here. There's no reason why every one of our students shouldn't have an opportunity to be employed by one of those institutions here in the city.
Are there other areas that you are focusing on?
Yes, as you may know, although I've been here now 16 months, I believe this is April, I was recently formally had my investiture about a little over 2 weeks ago. During the course of that talk, I talked about 3 initiatives that we're looking to do. One of the issues that seems to pervade a lot of discussion here in Charlotte, which is the upward mobility study that came in. And when you look at a place like Johnson C. Smith, and you look at the kind of access that we give to students, many of whom are first-time college students, many of whom come from underserved areas, we think that we are best position, if not, there aren't too many institutions better positions, I should say, in order to help improve on that statistic. So one of the focuses is I announced Pinnacle Opportunity Scholarship Program, in which we want to work with not only with the Charlotte Mecklenburg school system, but other businesses and local institutions here to identify local Charlotte students for whom Johnson C. Smith is a really good fit, and for whom we can really be an initiator of moving the upward mobility ladder. So that's one of the initiatives. And the other initiative is to deal with a problem that many small private institutions have, is we need to increase our endowment. And we're looking, some people might say it's not a modest goal, but a modest goal of getting our endowment up to about $100 million within 4 years. We're slightly under 70 right now.
Who is a good fit for Johnson C. Smith?
I think Johnson C. Smith is a great fit for that student who's looking for a nurturing environment, an environment that doesn't necessarily coddle you, but gives you the support that you might need in order to get through what is a very tumultuous time. College could be a very, very challenging period of life for some students, particularly if they've never been away from home before, particularly if they don't have guidance at home or external to their normal social status to help and guide them. And so a place like Johnson C. Smith is a place that really nurtures. It really is like being in a family. And we're small enough that you can know, although I don't yet know all 1,500 students, but you look at faculty and others who have those relationships with students. It's just unbelievable. I was at an event last night. We celebrated the 10th anniversary of one of our programs here. It's called the Biddle Institute, in which we utilize metacognitive and non-cognitive data to use for admission standards as opposed to the standardized tests and grade point average. And so there's a small percentage of our students for whom we use that as criteria. Programs have been in existence for 10 years. And last night we had a little bit of a celebration and we watched a film and then had a conversation afterwards. And it was amazing. At one point during the course of the evening, there were many students in the audience, many of whom were in the program, who got up and just thanked us for the kind of nurturing environment that provided them, that they might have needed a little bit more support that we can provide them to get them over the hump. And I think Johnson C. Smith, for a small portion of the student body, it's a wonderful place for that. For others for whom we want to excel in a small environment and who want to do it from a foundation that's here in Charlotte that gives them maybe a leg up in terms of getting one of those nice jobs that are out here in Uptown. So I think we can be a lot of things to a lot of people.
You mentioned the endowment.
Mm-hmm.
How would you grade the financial health of the institution at this moment?
We're financially stable. There was some issues when I arrived. We may talk about those in more detail, but when I arrived, the institution had just been put on probation by our accrediting body for financial reasons. It wasn't that we were unstable at the time. It was that we had an up and down performance over several years, and they wanted to make sure that we had stabilized. So we came in, we worked very hard, we stabilized, and were able to convince the creditors that we were worthy of not being on probation. We never lost our accreditation, and that we were able to resolve that within a year. But their challenges, we run on fairly close margins. So if we don't hit our enrollment targets, that's a challenge. If we have a major expense that we weren't anticipating, that could be a problem. So one of the things that we're trying to do now is to manage not to zero balance, but to a surplus. So, and that can be very helpful when you get those unexpected expenses, or on the other hand, you don't hit your revenue targets and you don't have as many students. So we're managing within those targets right now. And I think it's fair to say we're at a fairly stable ground.
Are there some unexpected challenges that have come up recently?
Yes, there are. We've had a few. The most significant of which, and some of your listeners may be aware of, is we had a recent problem with suspected mold. Last year, all over the country, but here in the Carolinas in particular, we suffered through 2 hurricanes. I think it was probably the wettest fall in summer, late summer into fall that they've had on record. And unfortunately, we had a mold bloom, I would say, towards the end of the fall. And unfortunately, it got some notoriety. But more importantly, it demonstrated to us that the problem might have been a little bigger than we'd anticipated. So we took immediate action. We told the students that we were going to inspect every room, which we did with an outside third party. We told the students that we would remediate where there was anything that even looked suspicious with a third party, which we did. And we told them that we wouldn't move any students back into a room that hadn't been cleaned by that third party, and we kept to our promise. Now, that sounds fairly simple. Those are 3 things that we said we would do. We were attempting to do that over the course of our Christmas break, which is about 2.5 weeks. Unfortunately, we were not able to fully complete and meet all of those promises. So we had a number of students who we couldn't move back into their rooms, and we ended up making a call. I think it was the right call to delay the beginning of the semester by 2 weeks, which was the right call. We got things kind of cleaned up, and knock on wood, we're doing okay right now. But that was certainly an unexpected challenge, very expensive, very labor intensive, but we made a commitment and we followed through on it.
President Armbrister, why would it be a good investment to contribute to Johnson C. Smith University?
I think any investment in education is a good investment, but an investment here at Johnson C. Smith is a particularly good one because we have students who are hungry and ready and are willing to go out and prove the returns on those investments. As an undergraduate student, I studied political science and economics. And so the idea of making investments, particularly investments in human capital, I think is really, really important. And I think from a public policy standpoint, many of the people who are policy wonks lose sight of that. And you look at the cutbacks in education, I think some people have turned their backs on education and I got mine, you get yours. But what they really are missing out on is that the social impact of having a well-educated populace is really important, not only to democracy, but to, our social fabric. And so I think investing in a place like a Johnson C. Smith and where our students are going to go out and be good and productive citizens who are going to contribute to the bottom line of the region, of the state, of the country is a great investment. And in Johnson C. Smith, we have students here who are really ready, willing, and able to go in and make those commitments and do the good work of what it is to be a good citizen. So I think it would be a fantastic investment if people were to invest in our students.
If I were a donor or an institution and raised a concern about past fiscal management or stewardship, what would you say?
I would say that I'm not aware of any misfeasance or malfeasance at all. I think we can do a better job, of course, of telling those donors, how their money is being spent. But we are in good financial grounds, and we are looking forward to increasing our resource base so that we can increase the investment in that human capital we call our students.
President Armbrister, Johnson C. Smith is a historically black college and university. Why should a college be primarily anything? Primarily male, primarily female, primarily African American? Aren't those distinctions remnants of segregation?
Some people might suggest that. So there are a couple of ways to answer that. I have 5 children, 4 of whom went on to education beyond high school. 2 of them went to HBCUs. And for them, and for very different reasons, they turned out to be really, really good spaces for them. So I often start with my daughter. My oldest daughter went to, and as you all know, we came from Philadelphia, went to the top public high school in Philadelphia, did well. And during the tour, we went on a 5-day, 7-school Southern trip in a minivan with 5 kids and my wife. So there were 7 of us in a minivan. Make a long story short, our last stop was in Atlanta, where we went to Emory and Spelman. And Spelman was the last school. And my wife is a graduate of Wellesley. We had encouraged our daughter to look at a single-sex school. And just too much to my wife's dismay, she said she didn't want to do that. She gets to Spelman and gets a tour by a young lady, I wish I could remember her name, a sophomore, who was the most poised, articulate, bright woman, like most Spelman women that I know. And my daughter was hooked. She said, "This is where I want to go." My wife and I were but pleasantly surprised. And being in that environment for her, she took off. She graduated Phi Beta Kappa, magna cum laude, and is doing very well. Married a Morehouse man, met her husband down there. So it was just a great place and a great space for her because it allowed her to really be herself in a way that she might not have been if she'd gone to a PWI, predominantly white institution. On the other hand, so that's one end of the educational attainment in my family. At the far end is my youngest son, I call him the prodigal son, who had never really been that great a student in school and got into North Carolina Central University and decided to matriculate there. And for him, it turned out to be a great place for him for many of the same reasons that it was a good place for my oldest daughter. It was a very nurturing environment. One thing that I remember walking around the campus with him, particularly in his department, every faculty member knew his name. I went to Penn at 4 years. People knew me, but I remember going to get recommendations for law school, and the professors would write good things, but they didn't really know me. They said, Clay was in my class. Yeah, he was one of 4 students that got an A in Econ 10A. That's about all I can say about him. He wrote well. That was it. So HBCUs, I think, have a place. But they also produce a disproportionate amount of graduates in our STEM areas. So they really, really do have a place in undergirding the national economy. And I think that places like Johnson C. Smith, although and the name is right, historically black colleges and universities, we do have to recognize that we have to be open to others. And to the credit of my predecessor, Dr. Carter, who reached out to the Latino community, last year, both our valedictorian and our salutatorian were Latina women. Just outstanding. And one told the story, had everybody in tears. The salutatorian, she was a DACA student. Her mother was deported, but her mother made her promise that she would graduate. She hadn't seen her mother in over 2 years when she graduated. Everybody was crying. So we're open. We'll never lose our historical nature as being historically black college university, but we are here to serve and provide access to education for those who are underserved in part.
President Armbrister, HBCUs are primarily a product of Reconstruction after the Civil War. What is the case for an HBCU that serves primarily a single race in the 21st century when we want more integrated societies?
Yeah, well, there's something to be said for integration, but there's also something to be said for people being able to maximize their potential. And I'm not saying people can't maximize their potential in integrated situations, but for certain students, have you ever seen the movie Tell Them We're Rising?
I have not.
You should take a look. It's a PBS documentary which goes through the history of HBCUs. And towards the end, there's a segment of a young woman who is much like my daughter, who could have gone anywhere. She had gone to predominantly white institutions during the course of her growth. And she said she just wanted to go to a place where she didn't have to explain anything, where she was always in the minority and things like that. And for HBCUs, particularly those that produce the high quality students, like this young lady, like my daughter, and even my son who found his space there, it was a really, really nurturing environment. And I don't think any HBCU should lose its historical character, but they have a special place in helping in a nurturing environment that maybe many other institutions don't do. So I think that there's a place for them, and I strongly support them, although I was not the product of them. Now, my older brothers, and you talk about Reconstruction, you don't have to even go back that far. My brothers are 9 and 10 years older than me. We grew up in South Florida, which was segregated at the time. When they graduated from high school in 1965, they couldn't go to the University of Florida. They couldn't go to Florida State. And luckily, they had an institution like Florida A&M University, which they attended. Both did very well. And Florida A&M, even beyond the fact where it was no longer the only option for students, maintained a high-quality business program, had high-quality pharmacy program, and HBCUs should be treated like many other institutions where they provide high-quality education for students. And it's not necessarily about race. It's about people who want to be in that kind of environment, in a nurturing environment.
You mentioned Spelman College.
Yes.
Spelman is consistently ranked first among 100 HBCUs in terms of its graduation rate and financial strength, and not representative of the environment and challenges that other HBCUs face. Spelman seems to be, in many respects, an exception along with Morehouse and other elite HBCUs. Forbes magazine reported that HBCUs have a 4-year graduation rate nationally of somewhere between 12 and 15%.
I've never seen that statistic. I think that seems unusually low, in my opinion. So I'm not going to question the source. But Spelman and Morehouse and the Howards are often looked at as the crowns. But there are many institutions out there doing this work who are taking these kind of unpolished stones and really polishing them up and making diamonds out of them. And for the vast majority of the students who attend them, I think these are outstanding places where students can really find themselves. I think a place like Johnson C. Smith, I just met 2 families. I was walking through the admissions office today, a family from Milwaukee and a family from Gaithersburg, Maryland. So they're nowhere near here or anything like that, but they came here in large part because of the opportunities that we have. I think one young man was going to go into the sciences and the other young lady, I forget what she was going to go into, but there are places like Johnson C. Smith's, like other institutions. North Carolina probably has a disproportionate amount, has more HBCUs than any other state in the union for students who really, really feel comfortable. And it doesn't make any difference that they are predominantly one race. I think many institutions are finding that if they're reaching out to those communities that are underserved, I think the statistics in Charlotte today, it is majority city. I mean, if you total up all of the what are considered the minority and racial minority groups, they probably outnumber just the normal European population. I think it's like 48-52 or something like that now. And that's what demographics are telling us. So I think the idea that students can't succeed in those institutions and they're only were good because they couldn't get into the institutions before is not a valid premise.
The premise that you proposed is that HBCUs provide nurturing environments that help African Americans succeed. Then one would then think that the graduation rate at HBCUs would be higher than in primarily white institutions for Black Americans. But graduation rates at HBCUs are below the national average. What do you make of that?
I'm not going to concede that particular statistic, but there may be a lot of reasons why graduation rates might be lower if that is in fact true. Among them, including the economic status. I mean, people don't finish school for a lot of reasons. And one of the biggest reasons, if not the biggest, is financial wherewithal to be able to get through school uninterrupted. we meaning HBCUs, often have a disproportionate amount of students who are on Pell Grants, who are eligible for who have the weakest economic status. And it isn't always the fact that it is academics. In fact, that's often not the case. Most of our students here who drop back in, are dropping out because of money. That is probably the biggest determinant of that. And so it's not surprising, if, again, not conceding that statistic, but if that statistic is true, that it wouldn't be surprising then that a disproportionate amount of students who are not able to finish within that 6-year period over which that statistic is given is largely because of economic reasons, I would offer.
What is the graduation rate at Johnson C. Smith University?
We are above, I would say we're in the 40 percentile graduation rate, 6-year graduation rate.
President Armbrister, to clarify, the graduation rate that I quoted of 12 to 15% was for a 4-year period. The numbers that are commonly used to compare colleges are at the 6-year rate.
That's correct. Yes. And you had asked earlier what our 6-year graduation rate is. It's in the 36%. So I was about that. I said about 40. So it's about 36% is our 6-year graduation rate. And as I noted earlier, oftentimes graduation rates aren't reflective of academic prowess. It's often reflective, particularly in the underserved community, of economic stress. Things come up in people's families. People don't have enough money. I mean, you'd be surprised at the activity that goes on here when we talk about clearing students, getting students cleared financially, because unfortunately, we can't afford to allow students here if they're not financially cleared. There's a lot of extra. Sometimes it's $500, and the things that these students have to do to try to clear is really challenging. And I had a young man, I remember just a little over a year ago, who came into my office, and he had been here. He was a junior, and he just couldn't go on, and we could not find. He had maxed out on his federal financial aid, and it was really money that was going to keep him from continuing on.
Is the preparedness of students going to college today different than it was a generation ago?
I know a lot of people think so. I don't know. I mean, today's students have so many other what I call distractions. When I was around, there were only 3 TV stations you could watch, maybe 4 with PBS, but nobody watched that back then. So I think they're prepared in different ways. And so maybe we have to look at ourselves and making sure that we're doing everything we can to adjust to students. Now, there are some challenges with students who don't write as well because they write in these short 32-character sentences with all the things, and my kids text me all the time, and I usually text in full sentences. I haven't gotten to the point of utilizing of the shorthand. So there are some challenges from time to time with preparedness, but it's a kind of a different preparedness. And I think with institutions of education, any institution of education, whether you're in elementary school, college, you have to meet students where they are. And the challenge is trying to figure out if you can get them where they need to be. When my first president that I worked for at Temple University, as the school was increasing in the objective, and I use my air quotes here, objective determinations of quality. So they were getting higher GPAs and higher SAT scores. But he was very perceptive, and he didn't think that we were producing necessarily better graduates. And he would go around the campus and he would talk to students and says, "How much are you studying for class per night?" And the kids, half hour, whatever it was. It was some ridiculously low number. So that got him to start thinking about the rigor of what was going on the campus. And this was anecdotal, so it wasn't scientific in any way. But it got him to start thinking about things like outcomes and how do we demonstrate that we have made the difference that we wanted to make. And so he started to look at things like, how are our graduates doing on the entrance exams to graduate school for MBAs, med school. And he started to kind of call the faculty and the educational side of the house out and said, look, we're getting these students who are purportedly better prepared. They have higher GPAs, they have higher SATs. It doesn't look like we move the needle significantly on these other outcomes. What are we doing about that? So what you have to do is just to be very cognizant of what are you doing to transform the student. That's what our obligation is. We get these students as they are, and it's our job to transform them. And I think particularly schools like Johnson C. Smith do a very good job of that.
What is top of mind for your students? What are they talking to you about?
Money, oftentimes. It's the ability to either make money or have sufficient money so they don't have to worry about financially clear. And I was down in the over in the student union early today. I kind of walked through from time to time, and I talked to young men who were, one of whom was talking about his plans. He wants to be an entrepreneur. He has these big dreams about what he wants to do. So I said, well, what are you majoring in right now? And he's majoring in biology. He wants to go on to become a physician's assistant, or he doesn't want to be a doctor, but because he really, really wants to be an entrepreneur. So it usually revolves somehow around making money, getting money, having money. So I encouraged him, but I said, how are we finishing? Because it's close to the end of the semester. So are you finishing strong? He said, yes, sir, finishing very, very strong. So that was really good.
I think that might be true on every college campus in America.
Exactly.
President Armbrister, what's the best part of your job?
What I just described, interacting with students. You can be in this office and work, and then luckily I'm my office sits in the center of campus, what we call a block. So if there's some activity going on down on the block, I can kind of run down and kind of get in the middle of it from time to time. But oftentimes I just kind of walk through the student union, put myself in places where students are, and to interact with them. And the students here are just unbelievable. They're so kind, so respectful. Usually you get a sir at the end of everything and a thank you, and just talking to them about what their interests are. So I've had, I mentioned to you earlier that there was an event last night at which students spoke at the 10th anniversary of the Biddle Institute. I had the opportunity earlier this week to be asked to attend, and luckily I didn't have to do anything other than attend. It was a pageant for one of our sororities. They were having a pageant for their kind of like sweetheart, and it was fascinating because the young men who were competing, there were 3 of whom had to perform. One was a young Latino young man. Another was an advocate here on campus of the LGBTQ community, and the other was just another young man. And they were just wonderful. And they had to practice for like months to do all this stuff. And watching the enthusiasm of the students in their room, it was just great. And that's what really makes you keep coming back to these jobs, interacting with the students.
President Armbrister, if someone came to you with a blank check and said that resources were not an issue, but you had to spend the money on one thing,
gosh,
what would you spend the money on?
Oh, boy. Only one thing? That's a tough one. So this is what I would spend. I would spend it on scholarships for students so that no student would have to interrupt their education because of money. I think it really is criminal that in this country, the greatest country in the world, that money often stands between a child getting an education. It shouldn't be. To me, it's almost like healthcare. Everybody should have healthcare. I think everybody should have an education and be able to get as much education as they are willing to work for. So that would be my answer. I would make sure that no student would have to drop out of school because of money.
What should people know about Johnson C. Smith University?
That Johnson C. Smith is really a treasure. It sits on the highest point here in Charlotte, and that it should be revered for what it has done for this community very quietly for 152 years. And part of what I'd like to do is to make sure that people really understand it, that it is at the forefront, it is in people's consciousness about how it can help continue to move this region forward.
President Armbrister, you grew up in Miami.
Mm-hmm.
What was your childhood like?
No, I had a great childhood. So I'm the baby of the family, and I think I mentioned to you earlier, my next sibling was 9 years older than me. And so by the time that I was in 3rd grade, both of my brothers who had lived in the house and had gone on to college, and my sister is much older, so I don't even remember her ever being around the house. So I was spoiled by my parents, who are Bahamian descent. I grew up in hot South Florida, where we played outside every day. Staying inside was just never an option. Growing up and climbing mango trees and running around trying to get coconuts off of coconut trees. And so I had a wonderful childhood. Went to the elementary school, which was a block from my house, but we lived in a segregated community. and it was a segregated school. But I remember every one of my teachers from first grade. I can name them. They were outstanding educators, made us really thirst for knowledge, but made sure that we got it. Back then, I'm not too embarrassed to say, although today would probably produce a lawsuit, there was corporal punishment in schools. And so if you didn't get your lessons, you might get a whack on the hand or the butt from time to time. And it was perfectly acceptable because the teachers knew your parents. and they would encourage that. But I had a wonderful childhood growing up. I lived on a block that was very stable. If anybody moved in or out of our neighborhood, I can maybe count on one hand. So my best friend growing up was born literally 3 months after me, and we were best friends through high school, went to the same high school, elementary school. His little brother, we played Little League football together. We played on the street outside our house together all the time. So it was a wonderful, wonderful childhood. I grew up in Northwest Dade County. So to get really specific. So I grew up, my mailing address was a place called Opelika, but it was technically an unincorporated Dade County at the time, but just that, so our mail came through Opelika. But it's called Miami Gardens. It's now been incorporated in Miami Gardens. But I grew up in the corner of 26th Avenue and 161st Street Northwest.
And how would you describe your parents?
Oh, boy. Great people, both of Bahamian descent, although they were both born in the United States, but by accidents of history, both ended up in the Bahamas through their adolescent years. His father was from a place called Cat Island in the Bahamas. It's the same island in which Sidney Poitier grew up. In fact, they were neighbors. I think we may be cousins. The island was so small, probably everybody was cousins on the island. But so my grandfather immigrated to the United States and helped build I think it was the Southeast Coast Railroad. And as they often did, much like you did on the West Coast, they had immigrants come in and build a railroad, never intending for them to stay. This may be true, but was that they would give you pay, a third of it you could keep here, but 2/3 of it you had to send back to your bank account to make sure you were going to go back. They really didn't want you to stay. But while he was here, my father was born, and my grandmother unfortunately was involved in a terrible accident when she was hit by a truck and perished. And my grandfather got so distraught, he took my father back to the Bahamas. And my father kind of grew up there up through kind of adolescence. My mother, on the other hand, has a much more exciting story about how she got back to the Bahamas. My maternal grandfather, also born in the Bahamas in an island called Harbor Island, the island of the pink sand, if any of your listeners have ever been to Harbor Island, beautiful island. But he was a Baptist minister who was a disciple of Marcus Garvey. And he met my grandmother, who was born in Key West, there, and he was the vice president of the UNIA, which was the United Negro Improvement Association, which was the organization that Marcus Garvey founded for promoting Black nationalism, Back to Africa movement, and my grandfather was a disciple of his. He had a church in Coconut Grove. Now, Coconut Grove is now the Tony Coconut Grove, but Coconut Grove back then was where the black people lived, and Coral Gables was where white people lived across the railroad tracks in that part of Miami. Anyway, the story, as I'm the youngest of the generation of cousins in my family, and the story had always been handed down that our grandfather had given a sermon one Sunday that the good old boys didn't like, and as a result of that, they came and kidnapped him, beat him within an inch of his life, spared his life on the condition that he'd leave and go back to the Bahamas. My mother was 6 years old at the time. This was 1921. I subsequently found out doing some research. I was actually doing research on my paternal grandfather, but ran across a historical journal that for the first time, anybody in my family, we'd all pass the story down orally. Nobody had ever seen it written down, and it was written down. It was like a law review article. It had footnotes. FBI apparently been following my grandfather, among others. There was a little variation on the story. What actually happened was this, that my grandfather was a disciple of the UNIA. He was being followed by the FBI. He had gone down to Key West and had given a speech. And the speech said something to this effect, that we, meaning black folks, we take care of their children, we feed them. We're not sure why we're treated like this. Why can't we just all get along? If we really wanted to be duplicitous. We could have easily poisoned them or something like that. Well, the thought was that he had just given a signal to all of the caretakers and housekeepers in Key West to kill all of their employers. And that's why he was then kidnapped and beaten within an inch of his life and returned to the Bahamas. I don't think my grandfather stepped foot in the United States again. So that was 1921. My mother and her siblings, my mother was 6 years old at the time, and my grandmother was subsequently put on a boat to the Bahamas. So that's where my mother grew up. And my grandmother died, they say, within 6 months. They always say she died of heartache. More likely she got bit by a mosquito and died of malaria. But then subsequently, both my parents ended up back in the United States, met, reconnected. They knew of each other in the Bahamas. They didn't really know each other, but they knew of each other, met, and got married. And my father worked for 40 years as a sky cap for Eastern Airlines, the largest employer in Dade County. That was all that, an African-American could do at the time. This is after he got out of the Navy after World War II, where he was a submariner. We think one of only few submariners who were African-American in the Navy in World War II. And my mother was a homemaker. She was a seamstress, a very, very good seamstress who could do the most complicated patterns. And I'm sure your listeners out there are familiar with Vogue, which is the most difficult of the patterns, or she could take a picture and draw it. So we grew up in a loving home there, and with very faithful people. We went to church every Sunday. I was an acolyte from the time I was knee-high to a tadpole till I went away to college and came home, in a very, very close-knit family and community.
President Armbrister, the story you told about your grandfather, did that become meaningful to you as a young man?
Absolutely. My experiences versus my brothers and my father were slightly different, because when you think about legal or de jure segregation, Brown versus the Board of Education was in 1954. So I was born 3 years after. I was born in 1957. So I started first grade 6 years after that, in 1963. So that was 9 years after Brown versus the Board. And as you recall, it said with all deliberate speed, deliberate speed didn't take effect in South Florida till about the 1970s. And as I mentioned earlier, both of my brothers, who graduated in 1965 from high school, never went to a class in which they sat next to or taught by anybody other than their own race. My brothers, both of whom went into the service after college, one of whom went to Vietnam and served honorably, said that the first time they were ever in a classroom with someone of a different race when they were in their service, which is just outrageous, I think. But that story about my grandfather was so important because it told of a time when, through prejudice, people took advantage of their position. And it's something that we never forgot. In fact, we're coming up on the 100th anniversary of that, and I'm trying to get my family together to go back and commemorate that action. As I noted earlier, we found that written down, and it was actually the front page news on the Miami Herald for 2 days. The first day, I think it was July of 1921, said Negro preacher kidnapped, feared dead. They almost started a riot because his brothers came out with their guns and stuff, and they were disarmed at some bridge. But he was then found the next day, and then he left. But it was a very powerful story, and one that we hand down and share. Now, I've gone through this particular side of the family we have a family reunion every 2 years. When I got that story, I copied it and I've handed it out to every member of our family so that we'll never forget that.
Has it informed or led you to have a certain race consciousness?
Yeah, I'm very conscious of it. First of all, I understand that for many people, particularly those who went before me, life was not easy at all. My father, who didn't get a chance to go to college, was a very, very bright man. He was educated in the British system. He could recite poetry. He wrote very well, too. In fact, he actually wrote a column for the weekly black newspaper called the Miami Times down there, for whom he was a typesetter as well. So he didn't have the opportunities we had, but he was very, very conscious that education was going to be the way to get to where you needed to go. So they were very, very, both of my parents were very, very big proponents of us getting an education, in part to overcome some of the challenges that you had to do with race. I mean, people don't realize that Miami is as Tony as it was. There was a time when if you couldn't really be on Miami Beach if you were black after dark. If you weren't working, it was almost like being in South Africa. You had to have almost a pass to be like, why are you over here? And that's the kind of life that my father lived. And who wants to live like that? So, yeah, it raised a level of consciousness about race in ways that maybe if you hadn't had those experiences, you might not have. And so we try to remind the young people in our family that it could easily turn back to that if you're not vigilant.
You went to the University of Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. What was your time at Penn like?
Great time. Some of the best 4 years of my life. Met some of my oldest and dearest friends there. At that time, as I said earlier, it's an opportunity for discovery. And I discovered a lot of things about myself. And they weren't all new. They kind of reconfirmed things that I knew about myself. So before I made the decision to go to Penn, I was almost on my way to Notre Dame, where I had an academic scholarship, not a football scholarship, although I was a decent player. I wasn't that good. But a coach, one of my football coaches at Miami Norland High School, said to me, there's a coach from the University of Pennsylvania who's going to be in town. I'm going to send about 4 of you guys over whom I think could get in to go see him. And who knows, maybe you get an opportunity to play football, extend your football career, play in Ivy League, go to an Ivy League school. And I did, and that changed my life. Because as much as, I probably would have done okay if I'd gone to Notre Dame, but being in Philadelphia just changed my life in ways that I'll never be able to appreciate. But so I got the opportunity. The only visit that I got, I was flown up, treated like a recruit, as much as Ivy Leagues do that. You fly in, they take you to Franklin Field, and you stand up and you're looking at the 60,000 feet stadium. What you don't realize is that by the time you get to play, nobody goes to games at Ivy League schools, unless it's Princeton, Penn. That was about it. I remember my first year, I was a freshman, and freshmen couldn't play varsity, right? So you had the freshman team. But the first varsity game, I'm thinking it's the first Saturday in September, big game, first game of the year. I'm going up and down my hallway. So, okay, who's going to the game? People look at me like, dude, I got a lab. I'm going to the library. Nobody went to the game. So that was a little bit of a downer. And my mother, God bless her, my mother would say, oh, I saw you all on TV. I would say, Ma, that wasn't us. That was Penn State. So she even got us confused from time to time.
From Penn, you went on to the University of Michigan Law School. Why the law?
Well, there's a time that I can hardly remember when I didn't want to be a lawyer. I knew I wanted to be a lawyer from the time I was about 8 years old. Why? I'm not sure, other than I know I watched the show Perry Mason. And I tell people, the younger people don't know who Perry. They look at me very quizzically, who's the Perry Mason? But for those who remember, the sole practitioner who got the murderer to commit that they did the crime and on the witness stand. I thought that's what I was going to be as a lawyer, but I never practiced law in court. I think I practiced for 12 years. I think I was in court maybe 5 times, and 3 of those to get sworn in.
What kind of law did you practice?
I practiced public finance law.
Your career then transitioned between city governance and education. What drew you in those directions?
Yeah, there are 2 things. One is public service in and of itself. I think we're all here to do things greater than ourselves. So anytime you can provide and give back through public service, I think it's a very worthy thing to do. Education became important because I know and I became aware and have lived the transformative powers of education. I mean, I grew up in a working class environment. I have met some of the top people in the country. And what's gotten me there is education. Education is so transformative, and that's one of the things that I want to impart on our young people, and I try to every day. I try to encourage them that while they're in these places where they're trying to get education full time, you're always learning, but knowledge is so critical, and the currency that knowledge is, I'm not sure people appreciate, because once you have knowledge about anything, nobody can take it away from you. They can't. And I used to do this little thing when at my most recent position when I was at Girard College, we had chapel once a month. It wasn't a religious service, it was really moral. It talked about our values and things like that. And the first chapel, we used to have guest speakers, but I always did the first chapel. And I did a chapel once because I wanted to impart upon them the power of knowledge. And I took with me 2 props. I had a little truck, and I had 5 $20 bills that I put in a frame. I asked 2 students to come up. One was in the primary school, maybe second grade. The other one was in the middle school, maybe in 8th grade or something like that. And I brought them up real quickly. And I said, I gave the truck to the second grade and I gave the $100 bill to the 8th grader who thought he was going to keep it. And I asked them each to give those things back to me. And they did. The 8th grader reluctantly, we thought he was going to keep the $100. And then I said to them, to the second grader, I said, what's 2 plus 2? And she said 4. And then I said to the 8th grader, I said, what's 5 times 5? I gave him a little higher order of math. He said 25. And I looked at him in the eye and I said, give it back. Give it back. And they looked at me quickly, like, give what back? I said, what did you just tell me? That answer, give it back. And they finally said, I can't give that back. And that was my point. Once you get knowledge, nobody can take it away from you. They can take your clothes, they can take your money, they can take a lot of things from you, a lot of possessions. But if you get knowledge, and it's the currency of this world. People look at riches in terms of dollars and things like that, but the richness is what knowledge and what you do with it. That's what's so important trying to get to these young people.
You've done so many things. What brings you the most joy?
Boy, success. And I don't mean personal success. We talked a little bit about the fact that I played football, and I use this a lot in my discussions with my upper management teams. I think football is the greatest team sport ever for a whole bunch of reasons that we won't go into. But when you have a team that's working together and everybody's doing their job and you're successful, that gives me a lot of joy. It really, really does. And it's not about personal pride. It's about the team. And so my goal is to make sure that we can build a successful team here and be successful for Johnson C. Smith and for the region. I'm a team player by and by, and I love success of teams.
What do you value most?
I value relationships. People ask me as you get older, and I know I'm probably entering the last quarter of the game of life. And people say, what do you like to do? And really what it comes down to, I like being around people that I like. And it could be on a golf course. It could be sitting around having a glass of wine or eating a good meal. It could be watching a movie. But I really value relationships now, particularly as you get older and you begin to lose people who have been in your life. You value them even more. So that's really what moves me.
Thank you for your time today.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Clarence Clay Armbrister is president of Johnson C. Smith University. He earned a BA in Political Science and Economics from the University of Pennsylvania and a JD from the University of Michigan School of Law. And now, a personal word. I've been to the Johnson C. Smith University campus many times. It is just a few blocks from where I teach at Johnson & Wales University. My campus is on Trade Street, which turns into Beatties Ford Road, where Johnson C. Smith University sits high on a ridge overlooking the city of Charlotte. Our two campuses often get confused. It's the name, of course. What are the odds of having two completely independent universities with the first name Johnson being blocks apart? The two universities have other things in common. Our student body is roughly the same size, of between 1,600 and 2,000 students. Our two campuses serve many students from the same background, first-generation college students from challenged socioeconomic circumstances. The majority of students on both our campuses are students of color. Faculty and staff on both campuses have the privilege of helping change lives. There are many differences between the two institutions: history, mission, curriculum, programs, but that's a tale for another day. I interviewed Clarence Armbrister in his office in Biddle Memorial Hall. The building is the oldest on the JCSU campus. The stone and brick and wood have the weight and texture of time. The steps into the building are indented and worn. Inside are plaques of names of men who served during the 2 world wars. A small and narrow elevator took me to the 4th floor that opened to a spacious hallway with heavy furniture on oriental rugs. I spoke with President Armbrister in his ceremonial office, appointed with a beautiful desk and conference table and seating areas that invited conversation. His working office was behind a door. That room had a small desk cluttered with papers. He had photographs of family and friends on the wall, including one of President Obama shaking hands with Mayor Michael Nutter of Philadelphia. He then closed the door to his working office, and we returned to his ceremonial office, where we talked seated in comfortable chairs. President Armbrister is 1 year into the job of guiding Johnson C. Smith University into the third decade of the 21st century. He is leading a university that was founded to educate freed slaves after the Civil War. That's 152 years of history in between. Most of those years were years of racial segregation. Today, the university is forging a path in an age of integration. As President Armbrister talked about his career in law and public service and education, I imagined being a college president. I've thought about it many times. It takes a certain set of skills, intellectual and pragmatic, visionary and administrative, personable and executive, to lead professors, students, and staff. It's a noble enterprise to lead a college. Raising money, building buildings, charming alumni, persuading faculty, inspiring learners. A college president embodies the culture and purpose of the place. On a good day, I can see myself doing what college presidents do. I think I would be particularly good assessing and recruiting talent. But there is a reason I haven't pursued academic administration, at least the work of department chairs and deans. I don't like managing people or being managed. I don't like charts and emails and graphs. I'm not particularly fond of goals and objectives and metrics. I don't like forms or databases or reports. Only a few meetings interest me, and I still schedule my day using a paper calendar. I would love being a college president, but I wouldn't love all the tasks that would be required of me to get or keep the job. The best part of the work I do on campus is learning something new and sharing it with students who are prepared and ready to learn. The challenge and reward of my work is engaging students who are not always prepared and ready to learn, and inspiring them to lead lives of meaning and purpose. Leading students to insight is good. Learning from them is even better. But if I were a college president and good at it, then there might be something as good as interacting with students every day. I would be thrilled by the strategic work of moving a historic institution forward. That is the charge that President Armbrister has leading Johnson C. Smith University. The work can be technical and dimensional, improving retention and graduation rates, developing programs and support for coursework, helping students emotionally and intellectually persist, and solving the cost and value equation of earning a degree. It requires asking deep questions and involving every department of the enterprise. It requires facing daunting realities. The work can shift the university from a red ocean to a blue ocean, from a place that is stressed to one that is vast in possibility. It can take an institution into spaces not in existence today. President Armbrister is bringing his life experience and skills to the task. This is Mark Paris, and you've been listening to On Life and Meaning. Additional support for this podcast is provided by the UNC College of Arts and Architecture, celebrating a decade of creative education in the arts and design. Thank you to our funding partners, and to my teammates, Andy Go, producer of the show, and to Chris Curriton, Art and Media Director. This is how you can help. Please write a review on iTunes. It helps us grow our audience. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter. We'd love to hear what you think about the show. And become a patron. We are on Patreon, a crowdsourcing platform that allows you to support what you value at a level you choose. Visit us also on our website on lifeandmeaning.com. Thank you for listening.